The hardest thing I have ever written in my life is not a casualty report. It is not a mission debrief after something went wrong. It is not the letters I wrote to families when men under my command did not come home. Those things were devastating in ways I still carry. But writing this, sitting down and putting into plain words the fact that a 72-year-old man who spent 42 years in the United States Army being paid to think clearly and identify threats was outmaneuvered completely and methodically by a woman who ran a bar in Makati, this is the hardest thing I have ever written, because those other hard things happened in a world I understood. This happened in a world where all of my training was not just useless, but was the instrument of my defeat, and I have had to find a way to live with that. My name is Aaron Brooks. I retired from the Army as a colonel in 2014 after 42 years of service. I served in 2 theaters, held senior planning and intelligence roles for the last 15 years of my career, and spent a significant portion of my working life doing exactly what the military trains its senior officers to do: identifying threats, assessing intent, planning responses, and protecting the people and resources under my responsibility. I am not telling you this to make my story more impressive. I am telling you because the specific nature of my professional background is the specific nature of my failure. Tanya Reyes did not fool a man who didn't know anything about deception. She fooled a man who thought he did. I retired to a house in Fayetteville, near Fort Bragg, where I had spent most of my career. My wife Margaret had died in 2011, 3 years before I retired, and I had kept moving through the remainder of my service on the momentum of structure and duty, which the Army provides in abundance. When I retired, the structure went with it. I had a house and a pension and a daughter named Elaine in Richmond who called twice a week, and a son named Marcus who was himself active duty and stationed abroad, and I had 30 years of habits built around being needed and none of the outlets for those habits that retirement was supposed to offer. I filled the first 2 years with veterans organizations and fitness and the slow, grinding work of figuring out who a man is when the institution that defined him for 4 decades releases him back into civilian life. I did not do that work particularly well. I traveled to the Philippines for the first time in the spring of 2019. A former Army colleague named Preston, who had retired 2 years before me and relocated to Cebu with his Filipino wife, had been telling me for years that it was worth a visit. I went for 3 weeks, stayed with Preston and his wife for part of it and in a hotel for the rest, and found that the country did something to me that I had not expected. The pace was different. The warmth of the people was not performative. The expat community in Cebu had a loose, undemanding quality people who had come from structured Western lives and had found something quieter without losing their sense of purpose entirely. I went back 6 months later. By 2020, I was spending 5 months a year in Cebu, and by 2021, I had rented a long-term apartment and begun thinking of the Philippines as a second home rather than an extended visit. I met Tanya Reyes in March of 2021. I was in Manila for a week. Preston had connected me with a group of retired American veterans who gathered occasionally in the city for dinners, informal and comfortable in the way of men who share a professional language, and one of those dinners ended at a bar in Makati that one of the group had recommended. The bar was called Harbour Light. It was clean, well-run, with a nautical theme that I assumed was decorative, and that I later learned was Tanya's personal aesthetic. She had grown up near the coast in Batangas and had wanted the bar to feel like a port. She was 44 years old and she owned and operated Harbour Light. She came to our table to greet us after we had been there about an hour, not as a performance of hospitality but as a natural thing, because she knew 2 of the men in the group from previous visits and wanted to say hello. She was not immediately striking in the way you might expect for a story like this. She was not dramatically beautiful or aggressively charming. She was direct and warm, and she had the ease of a woman who was comfortable in her own space and did not need to work to be liked. She sat with the group for about 20 minutes, joined the conversation without dominating it, and excused herself to attend to other matters. Before she left, she told me, specifically me, looking at me, that it was good to have a new face at the table. Then she went back to running her bar. That was the whole of our first meeting. I thought about that comment more than I should have over the following 2 days. It was a small thing, a polite thing. But I noticed that She had said it to me and not to the group, and I noticed that I noticed, and neither of those facts concerned me as much as they should have. I went back to Harbour Light by myself the following evening. She was there. She seemed unsurprised to see me and brought me a drink. I had not ordered the same thing I had been drinking the night before and said, "You looked like you needed to talk last night, but nobody gave you the opening." I told her I didn't know what she meant. She said, "You were listening very carefully to everyone else." That's usually what a person does when they want to be heard and aren't sure how to start. I stayed at Harbour Light until closing time that night. We talked for 4 hours and I told her more about my life than I had told most people in years. I want to examine that moment because it contains everything that matters about how this worked. She identified, in one evening of observation, the precise emotional condition I was carrying, the particular loneliness of a man who had spent decades in command, which meant decades of being listened to as a function of rank rather than as a function of genuine interest, and who had never quite found the right civilian language for what that felt like once the rank was gone. She named it without naming it. She created a space where I could talk and feel heard, and she did it so naturally that it felt like recognition rather than technique. I have spent 2 years thinking about that evening, and I still cannot tell you with certainty whether there was calculation in it or whether she simply had a gift for reading people and I happened to be readable. Both possibilities are equally difficult to live with. Over the next 3 weeks in Manila, I saw Tanya every day, always at Harbour Light, always in the context of her business, which meant there was never an explicit romantic framing to point to. She was the bar owner. I was a regular customer. We talked. She listened and responded and asked questions that showed she remembered everything from previous conversations. She asked about Margaret once I had mentioned my wife early in our second conversation, and the way she asked was so careful and so respectful of the gravity of it that I found myself talking about Margaret for 40 minutes. In a way I had not talked about her to anyone, including Elaine. When I finally stopped, Tanya said, "She sounds like someone who made you feel like the man you wanted to be." That was exactly right. That was precisely right in a way that no one had articulated to me in 10 years of grief. And I felt, sitting on a bar stool in Makati at 10 o'clock at night, something open in me that had been closed for a very long time. I flew back to Cebu at the end of March. I told Preston about Tanya over dinner and he listened without comment and then said, "How old is she?" I told him 44. He said, "You like her?" I said yes. He said, "Just be careful about the bar owner piece." I asked what he meant. He said that bar ownership in that context sometimes came with complicated financial dynamics and that I should keep my eyes open. I thanked him and moved on and did not give his comment the weight it deserved, which is something I will address later. At the time, I categorized it as the general caution of a friend rather than specific information worth investigating, which was a mistake in judgment I would not have made professionally. I went back to Manila in April. Tanya and I had dinner outside the bar, for the first time she suggested it, a place she knew near the waterfront. And it was the first time we had been in a setting that was unambiguously personal rather than professional. She was different outside Harbour Light in the way that people are different on their own time, versus at work, more relaxed and more willing to talk about herself. She told me that she had opened the bar 10 years earlier with money borrowed from family and had spent years building it to the point where it was reliably profitable. She told me she had never married, that she had been in a serious relationship in her early 30s that had ended badly, and that she had learned to be self-sufficient as a matter of survival. She said, "The bar is mine. I built it. No one can take it from me." There was something in the way she said that, a firmness, a pride with an edge of old pain that made me want to protect it for her. I noted that feeling at the time and thought it was a normal response to someone's vulnerability. I did not notice that it was a response she had engineered. By June of 2021, the relationship was real, at least on my side. We were in regular contact when I was in Cebu, and I was spending more time in Manila than I had planned, drawn back by a pull I recognized but could not fully account for. Tanya was consistent in a way I found stabilizing. She was never dramatically affectionate, never dependent, never asked for anything directly. What she did instead was create a picture of her situation that gradually made the need apparent without stating it. She mentioned, in passing, that the bar's rent had increased significantly. She mentioned that a supplier relationship had become difficult. She mentioned that she had some outstanding debt from the bar's early years that was becoming harder to manage as a solo owner. None of these were requests. They were just information, shared with the ease of a woman talking to someone she trusted about her real life. And because they were not requests, because she maintained a careful, consistent dignity in how she presented them, I felt the impulse to help as my own choice, rather than her direction. I lent her $30,000 in July of 2021. That is the word I used, lent. I told myself it was a loan, that she had not asked for it, that I was offering it because I wanted to and because the situation was real and the person was trustworthy. She accepted it with a gratitude that was restrained and genuine, seeming no excessive emotion, no drama, just a quiet thank you and a promise to repay when the bar's cash position improved. The restraint of her reaction was, "I now understand," exactly calibrated. An over-emotional reaction would have felt like manipulation. The quiet dignity of her acceptance made it feel like a transaction between adults who respected each other. She had read, correctly, that a military man with my background would be more comfortable with the absence of emotional excess than with its presence. The pattern that followed the first $30,000 is the pattern I have had to examine most carefully. It did not escalate dramatically or immediately. There was a 3-month gap before the next financial involvement, and in those 3 months the relationship deepened in ways that made the first loan feel like a small and natural thing in the context of something larger and more significant. She came to Cebu to visit me in September, the first time she had entered my space rather than receiving me in hers, which felt like a meaningful shift. We spent 4 days together, and it was uncomplicated and warm, and she left without any mention of money or the bar's difficulties. I noticed the absence of any financial conversation and interpreted it as evidence of good faith. It was evidence of patience. In October, she mentioned that the bar was facing a specific and urgent situation, a licensing renewal that required a payment she could not cover from current cash flow, with a deadline that would result in the bar's temporary closure if missed. The amount was $45,000. She said she was exploring options and did not ask me directly. I offered. She accepted with the same restrained dignity as before. I told myself the loan total was now $75,000, and that this was a meaningful but manageable amount given my financial position, and that the relationship and its value to me made it a reasonable commitment. I also told myself, and I want to say this plainly, that the military man in me had assessed the situation and found it credible. The licensing issue was real. I had looked up how Philippine bar licensing worked, and the framework she described was accurate. The deadline was real. She showed me a document. I had done what I believed was appropriate due diligence. What I had actually done was verify the framing of the problem she had designed for me to find credible. The amounts increased over the following 12 months in increments that were always significant but never so large that they broke the psychological pattern of the relationship. $60,000 for bar renovation costs that she said were necessary to retain her primary supplier contract. $80,000 for a legal situation involving the bar's original lease, which she described with enough specific detail that I did not think to verify independently. $75,000 for what she described as a family medical emergency, her mother's hospitalization, which she handled with such quiet pain that questioning it felt indecent. $90,000 for a business expansion. She said she had been planning for years and now had the opportunity to execute if she could secure the capital in a narrow window. Each amount came with a story that was coherent and verifiable at the surface level, and that I, the man trained to assess threats, assessed as credible because the surface level is all she ever let me see. My daughter Elaine raised concerns in the spring of 2022. She had noticed, from a reference I made in a phone call, that I was spending significant money on someone in the Philippines, and she asked me directly about it. I told her I'd been helping a friend with some business difficulties and that it was under control. She said, "Dad, how much have you given this person?" I told her it was a loan, that the amounts were manageable, and that she didn't need to worry. She pushed back. Elaine has always been more willing to challenge me than Marcus, who inherited my tendency to process privately and said she wanted to understand the situation better. I told her, with the particular firmness that a father uses when he wants a conversation to end, that I appreciated her concern and that I had it handled. She let it go. I can see now that she let it go not because she was satisfied, but because she knew from experience that pushing me past a certain point produced defensiveness rather than openness, and she chose to hold the relationship over the argument. That choice cost her father a great deal of money and cost her a great deal of worry, and I owe her more than I have said about that. By January of 2023, I had given Tanya $495,000. I need to let that number sit for a moment because it still does something to me when I see it written out. $495,000 over 18 months, in amounts that ranged from $30,000 to $90,000, each with its own story, each accepted with the same quiet dignity. None of it ever explicitly called what it was. I called it help. I called it loans, though no repayment had come. I called it investment in a person whose life I had become genuinely invested in. What it was, in plain and unambiguous terms, was money given to a woman who had understood from the first night she sat at my table that I was a man who needed to feel protective, and who had spent 18 months giving me opportunities to exercise that need in ways that extracted every dollar she wanted while leaving me feeling like the choice was mine. The end came in February of 2023. Not dramatically. Not with a confrontation or a revelation. I flew to Manila for a visit, and Harbour Light was closed. A sign on the door said temporarily closed for renovation. I called Tanya's phone. It rang several times and went to voicemail. I left a message and walked back to my hotel and told myself there was an explanation. There was no explanation. Her phone was disconnected the following morning. Her messages stopped being delivered. I went back to Harbour Light and spoke to a woman sweeping the sidewalk outside the adjacent business who told me the bar had closed 2 weeks earlier and that the owner had not been seen since. I stood on a sidewalk in Makati in the February heat and understood, with the particular clarity of a very cold and very complete realization, that I had been taken. I did not cry. I did not rage. I sat in my hotel room that evening and conducted, out of professional habit, what amounted to an after-action review of everything that had happened. I went back through every conversation I could remember, every financial transaction, every moment where I had made a choice to trust rather than verify. What I found, reviewing it with the cold eye I had not been able to apply while I was inside it, was that the operation against me had been nearly flawless. She had never asked for money directly, which meant I had never experienced the psychological signal of being solicited. She had maintained consistent dignity and restraint, which meant I had never experienced the emotional manipulation that would have triggered my defenses. She had verified enough surface details to pass my casual due diligence while keeping the deeper layers invisible. She had targeted my protectiveness rather than my greed or my loneliness, because a military officer's protectiveness is deeply conditioned and almost completely reliable once it has been engaged. And she had engaged it so gradually and so naturally that by the time it was fully activated I had been providing for months without examining why. I called Preston the following morning. He listened to the whole account and did not say anything for a long time. Then he said quietly, "Aaron, I said something about bar owners when you first told me about her." I said I remembered. He said, "What did you do with that?" I said I had noted it as general caution and moved on. He said, "I know. I'm not saying that to make it worse. I'm saying it because I wish I had been more direct. I told him it would not have changed anything. That was probably true. The mechanism she had built was already underway by the time Preston spoke, and my ability to receive a warning had been significantly reduced by a relationship that had been specifically constructed to make warnings feel like challenges to something I valued. Elaine flew to Cebu in March. She did not call to tell me she was coming. She booked the flight and sent me a message from the airport in Richmond saying she would be there in 22 hours and that she was not asking permission. That is my daughter. She arrived. We sat at my kitchen table, and she said, "Tell me everything from the beginning." I told her everything. She listened for 2 hours without interrupting. which required considerable discipline from her, and when I finished she said, "Dad, I'm not angry with you. I want you to know that first." I told her she had every right to be. She said, "I know, but being angry at you for being lonely isn't fair, and that's the part I can't get past. You were lonely, and she knew it, and she used it." I said, "I was not just lonely, I was careless." She said, "Both things can be true." That conversation mattered more than anything in the legal process that followed. A Philippine attorney filed an estafa complaint that has produced nothing recoverable. The bar was a real business, but had apparently been transferred to a different registered owner several months before Tanya disappeared, which meant the asset I thought was connected to the person I was helping was already gone by the time I was giving the largest amounts. The attorney found that the name Tanya Reyes existed in Philippine records, but that the woman who had operated Harbour Light under that name could not be matched to those records with any certainty. She had operated under a real name that may or may not have been hers, in a real business that had been quietly unwound before the exit, with no trail available to follow. The Philippine National Police took a report. Nothing has come of it. The shame is the thing I was not prepared for. I have said the word several times to myself in private, and I am saying it here because using a cleaner word would be dishonest. Shame. A colonel in the United States Army, with 42 years of service that included intelligence work, strategic planning, and the specific professional discipline of identifying threats and adversarial intent, was strategically defeated by a woman who ran a bar and understood one thing about me that my training had never taught me to defend against. She understood that the qualities that made me effective as an officer, the protectiveness, the mission focus, the commitment to the people under my responsibility, the deep satisfaction of providing security for those who needed it, were not professional qualities that I took off at the end of a career. They were who I was. And who I was, stripped of the institutional context that gave those qualities their shape and direction, was a man who needed to feel like he was still protecting something. She gave me something to protect. That is the entirety of it. She presented herself as a woman of independence and quiet struggle, a woman who had built something by herself and was working hard to keep it, a woman who did not ask for help but who clearly needed it. That profile was engineered for me specifically, or for men like me, men whose professional identity was built around protecting the vulnerable and providing for those under their care. I walked into Harbour Light in March of 2021 as exactly that man. I never walked out as anything else. The training that should have protected me was the thing that opened the door. I have had 2 conversations with Marcus since this happened, both brief, both conducted in the way that men in the military talk about difficult things directly, without excess, with the understanding that the facts are the facts, and discussing them serves more purpose than processing them emotionally in the open. He said in the first call, "Dad, do you want my honest read?" I said yes. He said, "You were mission tasked onto a target she selected for you, and your training executed against the wrong threat model. That is military language for what happened, and it is exactly accurate, and hearing it from my son, who wears the same uniform I wore for 4 decades, was something I will carry for the rest of my life." In the second call, he said, "What are you going to do?" I said I was going to live with it. He said, "That's the right answer." We did not talk about it again after that. I am still in the Philippines. This surprises people when I tell them, and I understand why it would. But leaving would feel like a withdrawal under fire, which is not something I have ever been willing to do, and the Philippines itself did nothing to me. A city did not deceive me. A person did. The country is warm and complicated and beautiful in ways I had not expected when I first arrived, and my life here, the walks, the expat friendships, the slower pace that has done more for my health than anything I tried in Fayetteville, is real and worth protecting. Preston is here. Elaine has visited twice since March. I have found a rhythm that is not the same as the rhythm I had when Tanya was part of it, but is real in the way that things are real when they are not constructed to serve someone else's purpose. I think about the after-action review I conducted the night I understood what had happened. I have run that review many times since, and the conclusion is always the same. The threat she represented was not the kind of threat that military training teaches you to identify, because military training teaches you to look outward, to look at what someone might take from you by force or by stealth, at what an adversary might do to your resources or your personnel or your mission. It does not teach you to examine what you want to give, because in the military context what you give is governed by the institution. It does not teach you to be suspicious of your own impulses toward protection and provision, because those impulses are virtues in uniform. The moment they become vulnerabilities is the moment the uniform comes off and you are a private citizen with no institutional structure to govern where the impulses go. That transition is the gap she found. That gap cost me $495,000. I am not the same man I was before Tanya Reyes. That is not entirely a loss. The man I was before was carrying a grief I had not processed and a purposelessness I had not acknowledged and a need to be protective that had no legitimate object. Those things are more visible to me now than they were, and visibility is the prerequisite for doing something about them. I have talked to Elaine more in the past year than in the 5 years before it. I have allowed myself to sit with grief about Margaret in a way I never permitted when there was always another duty to attend to. I have, slowly and imperfectly, started to understand the difference between protection as a profession and protection as an identity, and why confusing the two is the specific vulnerability that cost me everything it cost me. She outsmarted me. I have said that to myself enough times that it no longer produces the visceral reaction it used to. She outsmarted a colonel with 42 years of service and a professional background in strategic intelligence. And she did it not with superior information or superior resources, but with superior understanding of the one battlefield where all of my training was irrelevant, the interior one. The place where a man's needs and his habits and his unexamined assumptions about himself live. She knew that ground better than I did. She maneuvered on it with patience and precision. And I, who had spent 42 years learning to know my enemy, had never once thought to learn myself. That is the lesson. It is expensive. It is mine.